Back in the day, Miss Margot ran Miaville's most beloved bakery, Margot's Muffins. For years, she sold her famous chocolate muffins for $2 apiece. Then, a year ago, Margot raised her muffin prices to $2.50. By the end of the year, they were $3.50. Back in my day, you could get a muffin for about a dollar, but I digress. As the months passed, the gas station and local bus service both hiked their prices. Before anyone realized it, the hairdresser, the local jeweler, the cafe by the river all had to adjust their prices. That's right, this small town was hit with inflation. This kind of domino effect happens all the time on a local, national, or even global scale. But why? By the end of the lesson, you should be able to answer the following. What is inflation and what causes it? How can we analyze the impact of inflation? What happens when inflation occurs as an economy is contracting? And you should start to think about our big picture question. How should we evaluate and act on news about inflation? So, what is inflation? Basically, it's a sustained increase in the prices of goods and services in an economy over time. And while inflation means higher prices, it also can mean that the purchasing power of money is decreased. That means every dollar you have is really able to buy fewer goods. Why does it happen? There are two main reasons for inflation: rising production costs and increasing demand. And they're sometimes actually related. First, let's take a look at rising production costs. Do you remember what the four factors of production are? We also called them resources. Look familiar? Yep, it's human resources, natural resources, goods, and capital. When any of these four get pricier, inflation might be just around the corner. Take human resources. Maybe unemployment is decreasing. So now that fewer workers are available, businesses have to compete for the best talent. This competition drives wages up. In other words, the cost of labor increases. For example, Miaville's cafe struggled to find help, and new hires demanded higher wages. What about natural resources? External events like natural disasters can affect the availability of these resources. Remember our story about the muffins? It turns out that one poor wheat crop was the reason for Miss Margot's more expensive muffins. She had to pay too much for her ingredients. When there's less available, producers can charge more for them. For goods, think about the parts or ingredients that go into the production of a final product. Now that the economy is global, the supply of intermediate goods can be disrupted by weather, pandemics, wars, or politics. Less supply leads to higher prices. Think about that jeweler back in Miaville. She had to raise prices because the cost of all those clasps and beads that she uses had skyrocketed. Capital, on the other hand, can refer to things like machinery or to the money used for business investment and growth. If the maintenance of these tools gets pricier, or if interest rates for borrowing money rise, this too can contribute to inflation. So, what options do businesses have to compensate for these rising production costs? They can change factors of production to something cheaper, or they can raise prices. So these increased costs are often passed along to us, the customers, resulting in inflation. What about the second main cause of inflation, increased demand? Remember earlier in the course when we discussed shifters of demand? Well, one of those shifters is changes in income. And income is definitely related to employment levels. So, what happens to demand when unemployment is decreasing? Well, more people working means that more people are able to afford different goods and services, and that means an overall increase in demand. And as you know, with higher demand, market equilibrium will shift, and producers will charge more for their goods and services. So, low unemployment leads to higher wages, which increases demand, creating price hikes and inflation. Wait a minute, this sounds familiar. Higher wages are the same thing as increasing labor costs, right? And isn't that a factor of production? Yep, in fact, increased labor costs can contribute to inflation twice. Once by directly increasing the costs to producers, and once by helping to increase demand. Okay, let's take a minute to check in. Imagine that you are a regular at the Miaville Cafe. Lately, you've noticed fewer options with fruit on their menu. Then, you overhear a repairman complaining about the cost of parts for the coffee machines. On another visit, you notice a help wanted ad that mentions they will pay the highest rates around. And the cafe is not the only place you're seeing this kind of thing. Given these observations, can you name 3 factors that might hint that inflation is on the rise? Okay, so nobody likes paying higher prices, but inflation isn't necessarily a villain in our story. Increasing prices can help businesses maintain or even increase their profitability. Like every other economic indicator, we need more information to reach a conclusion. One crucial question is, are our wages keeping up with this inflation? If wages are increasing faster than inflation, it's probably a good sign. People are better able to buy the goods and services that they need, and maybe more. Even if muffins cost more, people will still buy them. But if wages aren't keeping up with inflation, it becomes harder and harder for people to buy those things they need to survive, never mind thrive. That affects everyone, from the customers at the Miaville Cafe to the business owners on Main Street. Essentially, we can all buy less with the same amount of money. When looking at inflation, we also need to get a better idea of what sort of goods are experiencing price increases. For example, if the prices of staple food items like bread, milk, and eggs are increasing quickly, this might impact everyone, especially those individuals and families who make the least amount of money. But if inflation is mostly impacting luxury goods like sports cars, it may not be as detrimental to the overall economic health of a nation. What does it look like when inflation is taken to the extreme? We call that hyperinflation. It's pretty rare, but it can be quite dramatic. You might remember the classic example of hyperinflation, Germany after World War I. The German economy was devastated after the war and the Treaty of Versailles, and the German mark became practically worthless. People even used cash as wallpaper or kindling because those were better uses. Thankfully, hyperinflation is extremely rare and unlikely to happen in most economies today. Okay, let's take a minute to check in. A politician tries to say that rising prices and increasing inflation make it abundantly clear that the nation's economic health is in jeopardy. What would you say in response to that statement? So, it makes sense that prices would rise when everyone is flush with cash. But Did you know that occasionally inflation happens when the economy is not doing well at all? It's called stagflation. Stagflation is when inflation occurs alongside economic contraction and rising unemployment. A good example of stagflation occurred in the 1970s in the United States. One major factor was war in the Middle East, which led to an embargo, or restrictions on oil sales to the US. That meant less supply and higher prices. Rising oil prices combined with existing inflation and slowing economic growth led to a situation where prices were rising at the same time that the economy was stagnating. Inflation reached a peak of over 14% in the US. This combination makes it incredibly challenging for an economy to bounce back and expand. Policy measures that might combat inflation, like raising interest rates or reducing government spending, can worsen unemployment and vice versa. It's like trying to cool down your food by blowing on it while someone else is trying to heat it up. They counteract each other. We'll talk about how the government addresses inflation in a later unit, but for now, it's good to be aware of what stagflation is, so you can be on the lookout for the warning signs of high unemployment plus inflation. Now let's take a few minutes to apply what you've learned. Imagine you're a business owner in Miaville. You're having a hard time making ends meet. Production costs are rising, but your sales are decreasing due to reduced consumer spending. Your workers are asking for a pay raise due to increased living costs. You can't afford it, but you also know you don't have to, since there are plenty of others looking for work these days. What signs of stagflation can you identify in Miaville? Let's take a few minutes to recap what we've learned. Inflation is a sustained increase in the prices of goods and services in an economy over time. It's influenced by rising production costs, from those of human resources, natural resources, intermediate goods, and capital. Inflation isn't inherently bad. It's crucial to consider whether wages are rising with inflation and which goods, staple versus luxury, are experiencing price hikes. On rare occasions, inflation is made even more complicated when unemployment is rising at the same time as prices. That's called stagflation, and it's much trickier to solve. So the next time you hear about inflation in the news or feel the pinch in your wallet, remember that it's just one piece of a much larger economic puzzle. Tomorrow, we'll be looking at another piece of that puzzle, the Consumer Price Index. Until next time, this is Bea, reminding you to keep investing in your future, one lesson at a time. I'll see you next time. Hey, hey.